You've likely heard about ChatGPT, and you might even have the application downloaded on your phone. But have you thought about how technology, and artificial intelligence specifically, will impact your job and the future of work? Michigan State University's College of Social Science launched the Future of Work initiative to answer this very complex question, starting by hosting the university's first Future of Work conference on March 8, 2024. Faculty from across MSU colleges and representatives from community organizations came together to collaborate and engage on the subject. Expert-led interactive discussions centered on 4 topics, including human interaction with artificial intelligence, accessibility changes to technology, new skills in the labor market, and government engagement. Tara Barron is the initiative's director and John Richard Butler II Endowed Professor in MSU's School of Human Resources and Labor Relations. Haejin Rowe is an assistant professor in MSU's School of Human Resources and Labor Relations. Tara, why don't we start? Give us a little bit of your background, kind of why you're interested in this topic in general, and why are you pursuing these things at MSU instead of somewhere else?
Sure. Well, I've always been a huge fan of the land-grant model. I think it's really important that when we do research, we're thinking about how that knowledge will be used to make people's lives better. And the beauty of a land-grant university is that it's designed for that we're not separate from the community, we're part of the community. So that's always been very appealing to me since the beginning of my career as an academic. My background is in industrial organizational psychology, which is about using psychological knowledge to improve people's work lives, their careers, the way that they learn, the way they connect to each other in the workplace. I've had a number of different diverse work experiences that have sort of helped shape the way that I think about that topic. Most recently, I was at the National Science Foundation as a program officer where I ran the Future of Work program. And there we got to know just all of the different ways that people are inventing new technologies for the purpose of improving how work is done, improving people's work lives. What I tried to do there is really emphasize the fact that it's not technology that matters, it's actually people that matter, right? Technologies don't make decisions, technologies don't have effects. We have effects through technologies. So the value of the way that I try to think about things, which is how are people making decisions and how can we help them make better decisions so that technology actually does have positive effects and doesn't harm people, has always been really important to me. So now at this point in my career, I'm in a position where I'm trying to bring together lots of people who think about this problem in different ways so that we can learn from each other and make something bigger than any one of us.
Cool. And Haejin, tell us a bit about your research interests and why you're at MSU.
Yeah, so I'm an assistant professor at the School of Human Resources and Labor Relations, and I have a PhD from MIT Sloan School of Management, and so in a business school. And what was very special about that program was that it was interdisciplinary in nature, and so just really thinking a lot about the perspectives of managers and also the perspectives of workers. And so when I was looking for jobs and looking at different, academic institutions, MSU really stood out as one of the very few programs that's actually left in the country that really values that interdisciplinary approach, sort of thinking about, all right, what is the role of management and what is the role of workers into making certain decisions possible, right? And so it is a school of not just human resources, but School of Human Resources and Labor Relations. And so to me, that was just so special about MSU. And so my little bit of my background, I come from a policy background where I worked right after my PhD in DC at a Center for Economic and Policy Research. And so there I engaged in a lot of different non-academic research work that was very relevant for policy purposes. And so even, during COVID, actually, and so I wrote this wonderful report that just really focused on, who is affected the most by COVID, thinking about the demographics of frontline workers who are struggling at the front lines, who did not have options of working remote. In terms of my research, so I often think of my research in three buckets in the space of future of work. So first, I am really interested in this sort of increase in fractured and changing employment relationships. So we are actually starting to see more and more companies contract out work to other smaller firms and online platform companies who then supply temporary workers and contractors to carry out work tasks that were traditionally done by regular full-time employees in-house. So these employer strategies can sort of lead to variation in the quality of jobs, and that's what I really am interested about. How do these kinds of changes really impact the lives of workers and their well-being? Second, I also look at the changing demand for skills and skill competition of jobs. And so at a time when there is a ton of public discussion around technological change and what that means for workers, the role of skills and whether there is a skills gap becomes an important topic to talk about, right? So third, which I want to spend more time talking about today actually, is the proliferation of the use of new technologies. So such as algorithmic management systems, which is basically used to delegate traditional managerial functions to algorithms in workplaces. And so some early examples of this are found in gig economy work, such as Uber and Lyft, where these machine-learned algorithms are given the responsibility for making and executing decisions about work. But these systems are, however, now found in many other sectors in the economy, including the hospitality sector, which is what I'm actively looking at right now for my research. So it is a team of scholars from 5 different institutions, and Unite Here, the largest hospitality workers union in the country. And so it's being actually supported by National Science Foundation, which Tara was part of. And so we received $2.5 million of funding from NSF, and this really shows that this is really the center of the issue right now for discussion, and a lot of people are paying attention to it.
And Tara, you recently were the lead organizer for the Future of Work conference at Michigan State University. Tell us a little bit about why you thought this topic was so important that you needed a conference on it.
Sure. Well, the value of a conference like this is that there are all of these pockets of talent all over the university that didn't know about each other. And when you start having conversations with people like Hijin, who are right in the center of some of the most important issues that we have to talk about as a society right now, and you think, wow, how amazing would it be if they talked about the same issue from their relative perspectives, to just see where the gaps are, where the opportunities for combining things are. It was really had a lot of potential to move the research forward and get people thinking in a different way. The other advantage is that a lot of people who work in universities don't have the opportunity to hear directly from the voices of people on the ground often enough. And when you lose that connection to the real world, your research loses its value. Like, part of the thing that I think is so great about Hijin's research is that she's got the union as a partner, right? Thinking about what is the actual voice of the workers here. So the other thing we wanted to do with this conference is make sure that people who are working in the Lansing community were there too. And that not as spectators, but as active and equal partners in thinking about what are the most important issues that people should be thinking about and studying. And we did that. And I thought the conversations went incredibly well. There was a lot of energy and excitement for the fact that MSU really is in a unique position to move the conversation about the future of work forward. Like, there really isn't anywhere else that has our combination of expertise and then also this really interesting sense of place. Like, Michigan right now is a very interesting place in terms of how is the workforce changing? What is it going to look like in the future? People have concerns and hopes. And then we have these amazing world-class experts in the same room. I mean, it was really an opportunity to sort of organize and move forward in the same direction.
Well, and maybe the phrase is obvious, but when we say future of work, how are you defining it or looking at it?
I don't think it's obvious at all. I think that's a really important question to ask because people use this term a lot. I've heard this term being used frequently for at least the last 10 years. And in the beginning, it meant something like, will robots take all of our jobs? right? Can we automate every single thing that a person does? And there were lots of fears that there wouldn't be enough work, we'd have mass unemployment, or maybe some hopes that we'd all be sitting on the beach drinking while robots brought us Mai Tais, right? Like, but there wasn't a lot of sense of what are the things that are uniquely human, like that can't be automated, that shouldn't be automated. Now I think the conversation about future of work includes those and then other concerns as well. So I would say it's about how are emerging technologies changing what work is done, how we do that work, how we connect to each other. I think remote work is a part of that conversation. Additionally, we have issues such as the aging workforce, changing demographics of the workforce, changes in the kinds of social contracts that are part of work that used to be there that aren't there anymore, right? So Hedgen mentioned precarious work, or people who don't have the kind of employment security that they deserve, but instead are working for an anonymous platform and just sort of treated like a machine, right? So all of these issues are included when we say what is the future of work. I'd also add, too, that it has a lot to do with how do we respond to these challenges as a university? Like, how do you prepare people for this world of work? Like, what does education and training look like in this kind of world where things change quickly and people need to adapt? And it isn't clear what the value of a skill will be. I mean, I'll just note that a lot of people think that low skill, which I tend to object to that term. I can't think of any job that is actually low skill. If you've ever been a server, you know there's quite a bit of skill involved in that job. But I will say less formal education, that jobs that have less formal education are more at risk of automation, and that's just not true. It's, to use an example that we've used before, it's very, very difficult to make a machine that picks fruit without smashing it, or that works, in different kinds of weather conditions. It's difficult to make a self-driving car that can drive at night. But it's very easy to make an algorithm that can scan legal documents for discovery and sort of do the work of a lawyer. So I think we need to separate out the question of skills and training and education from what kind of work is uniquely human or shouldn't or can't be automated.
And so what were some of the main themes you organized the conference around, and who was there? What are some of the things that came out of it?
Yeah, we had representatives from 6 colleges, as well as over a dozen Michigan area organizations, some employers, some workforce development organizations, some education organizations, all thinking about this issue from different angles. We organized the conversations into 4 themes. The first theme was human automation systems. Like, how do people work with AI or robots or other technologies? How do you delegate decision making? How do you, if a machine gives you a recommendation, how do you decide to accept that recommendation or not? The second theme was skills and training. So are we moving away from a world of 4-year degrees? Are we looking at more short-term certifications, alternative certifications, pathways? Something that I'm very interested in my research is work-based learning, where instead of the model where people go to college and then they go to a job and then they do that job for a while, maybe you go to work first and then come back to college, or maybe you are doing both at the same time, or maybe there are caregiving responsibilities that interrupt that pathway. And people are moving in much more circuitous and winding pathways, and just understanding those pathways was the second theme. The third theme was governance and policy. So what are the new policies and protections that workers need, that we need to be thinking about as we deal with this new world? I mentioned earlier that technologies don't make decisions, people do. And I just want to underline that again. Like, technologies do not cause unemployment. Economic decisions cause unemployment, right? If your machines make you 10% more productive, it doesn't mean you have to lay off 10% of your workforce. It means you can make 10% more stuff if you want to, right? But you are making a decision as a human being about how you use tools and what happens to your human workforce as a result. So that was the third theme, this like policy and governance conversation. And then the last theme was access to work. So access to work, meaning how can we use technologies potentially to make work more accessible for people who need extra supports? That could mean something like, is there a bus route that goes to the factory at the time that you need to be there, which is something that people often forget when they build a new factory. Like, is there a bus route there at 5 a.m., right? Or it can mean developing assistive technologies for people who are neurodiverse or have disabilities that require accommodations. Technologies can potentially expand work opportunities. It can also box people out from the workforce unintentionally. So one of our speakers, Anne-Marie Ryan, gave a great example of voice recognition technology that can't handle people who speak with a stutter. It can't understand them. And so if you use this technology, you are unintentionally discriminating against some of your potentially most talented workers. So that was our fourth theme. And the themes obviously are not totally interdependent. They connect to each other, but we sort of group the conversation that way just to facilitate the conversation. We had people speaking from a perspective of law, education, human factors, engineering, psychology, sociology, economics. I'm sure I'm forgetting some. But the thing that I loved is that there weren't any like fights or attempts to guard turf. There was a common understanding that everybody needs to contribute to these problems. They're too big for any one discipline or department to own, that everyone really does need to be at the table and listen first and speak second. And that was a really nice outcome of the conference.
Hey, Jen, your reflections on the conference, and tell us more about your current research.
Yeah, and so I actually really liked the way that Tara just phrased technology and thinking about technology, right? And so technology basically does not make decisions, right? And so and I think it's also similar to what I'm finding in my research, right? I'm also finding that technology isn't necessarily inherently good or bad, right? It really depends on how employers decide to use them and, how they decide to configure the specific details of how technology works. And so in the example of the hospitality industry where, these algorithmic management systems are, starting to be used more and more, we actually see that managers have a ton of discretion over how it gets configured. And so one example is that these technologies sometimes are used to assign rooms for housekeepers. And, there is a varying degree of automation that goes into it. But basically, they become, this technology that fundamentally changes the way in which work is done by the housekeepers when they try to decide the order in which they clean the rooms. And one feature of the technology is actually monitoring because, it's also the inherent nature of the technology, right? And so you can actually collect a ton of data as to what workers are doing, which rooms they're cleaning, and so on and so forth. And when we talked to the workers, the housekeepers, they actually said one obviously harmful effect of it is that they feel like they're constantly being monitored. So the managers know which rooms that they're cleaning, how long it's taking them to clean the rooms. However, some actually say that they like that they're being monitored because of the safety concerns. And so you could imagine that there are a lot of these incidents that happen at hotel rooms, and oftentimes it's hard to report. I mean, they do have these safety buttons that they carry around, but they get automatically linked to the cell phones that they bring around to clean the rooms, and therefore they feel a bit more secure. And so that is just one example as to how how housekeepers can how housekeepers perceive this technology based on how it's being used. And so I think this is just such an interesting way in which for us to think about, right? Like, at which point do we care that workers have more input into how this technology is being used? And so, my view in all this is that, it is really important to bring worker voice into sort of the deployment and development of these kinds of systems. And so there is actually a ton of research that's being done. Technological change is actually not new, right? And so over the decades of technological development, we have actually seen that when firms actively involve worker input, and during the technological implementation process especially, and if firms invest in training the workforce, there are benefits that can come with these technological deployment. And so I think that's something that's important for us to just remember.
Well, and we do hear a lot about artificial intelligence. People are still kind of grappling with what is that, but it apparently is going to have a large impact on our future of work, right?
I guess. No. So I think what Hidden just said is really important, which is that technological progress is part of human history and has always been, right? So there are questions to ask about what makes an artificial intelligence potentially different than other kinds of change. But in a lot of ways, we can understand how people will use AI based on how other industrial revolutions have played out, right? So absolutely every industrial revolution introduces new kinds of questions. In the third industrial revolution, where computers were sort of introduced, that meant that people were able to communicate across the globe, right? And so now we have questions about what does a globalized workforce look like? How do you interact with people who are very different culturally than you? Like, these are not anticipatable based on previous industrial revolutions. But the ways that technology is now changing work, I think, are not qualitatively different, but rather just an extreme extension of what we're already seeing. So there are tasks that can be automated. There are consequences. What Hedgen just said, though, about thinking about the unanticipated consequences of new technology is really, really important. So you can develop a tool that is life-saving for its intended purpose and then can be used to harm people, of course, right? This is not unique to artificial intelligence. In the case of decision-making tools, which is what a lot of these AI models are, right? They make decisions, or they're Gen AI and they're creating language. But in the case of decision-making algorithms, there are questions about when should I listen to this advice and when should I ignore it, right? Like, how should I use, like, if I'm a physician and I have a radiology algorithm that says you should probably look at this person because this scan looks suspicious, right? How do I balance that with my own expertise? And so this is a new kind of problem where people need to develop a new set of skills about evaluating their own expertise in contrast to this tool and figuring out, when should I listen to the tool? When should I listen to my own gut? Right? And that's not something that people are great at in general. In the case of the hospitality workers, like, managers are deciding, okay, this algorithm says that this is the most efficient method, but I have information that it doesn't. I know my people. I know this building. I'm going to exert my own expertise and fix this and make it better. And that's what we want people to always be doing, right, is balance your own expertise accordingly. There's another evolving field, they call it automation surprise, when an automated tool kicks in a way that you weren't expecting and you aren't ready to react, and so it causes a potentially catastrophic problem. I mean, they talk about that with pilots a lot, where you're a pilot, you know how your airplane works, you're in a groove, and then it does something unexpected, and it's not part of your training, you don't know how to respond to that. And so it causes a very serious problem where you try to override it or you don't try to override it because you trust it too much. Either way is a bad move. So understanding how people interact with automated systems and AI, I think this is the essential emerging area here when we talk about how people use it at work. And it's not just an ethical and moral issue. It is that also, but it's also just a practical issue, right? I mean, the understanding the consequences of people's implementing of new tools. There's a example I always use. There was a device bill. It was called an Occupy. It went under people's desks at work, and it was invented for the purpose of improving climate control in a building. Like, you could sort of figure out when people were generally around, and you could turn off the air conditioning when no one was around. Great, totally innocuous tool, until the first manager figured out that they could punish people who weren't at their desk long enough, right? And then what do people do after that? Well, they start trying to trick it. They conceal the box, they hide the box, they put a dummy in their chair, right? They find a way to work around the technology because it's being used to harm them. And so any tool that is potentially developed for good purposes can absolutely cause negative consequences when people start trying to game the system and work around it.
What about the whole rise of remote work that really came out of the pandemic? I don't know if that was coming anyway, but where do you see that going and what's its impact?
Yeah, it's interesting to watch the discourse happen where people are suddenly saying, oh, maybe everyone needs to come back to work that went remote because we think there's something unique about in-person collaboration or presence. My suspicion is that many managers don't know how to manage a remote workforce. It makes them uncomfortable, and they want to see the person. They want to look them in their faces. So that's a manager education problem, right? To say, how do you manage a remote workforce? And what kinds of tasks do actually require in-person collaboration? I think there is something that is lost when people are remote. There is something different about an in-person meeting, right? We can talk about it as the meeting before the meeting and the meeting after the meeting, where you're walking out of the room together and you're sort of following up on interesting ideas. You're forming connections. You're asking people what they do that weekend. Those do have a positive effect on certain kinds of work, but there's also a lot of work that does not require that, right? So what we want to encourage people to do is think about what are the kinds of tasks that need to get done and how many of them actually need to happen in person, and support managers to manage a remote workforce. A lot of this surveillance that we're talking about here is a direct result of managers feeling uncomfortable managing people they can't see and wanting to, well, I'm going to put a tracker on their computer so I know if they're sneakily doing their laundry in the middle of the day. We need to get people away from worrying about that. Like, so what if you're doing your laundry in the middle of the day? Are you meeting your objectives as an employee? And if so, it does not matter if you're doing your laundry in the middle of the day, right? So design work better, lead people and manage people better, and remote work should not be a problem. Of course, that's ignoring all the people who can't work remotely for their job. And I think that's most people, to be clear. Most people cannot work remotely. And it is a special kind of privilege to be able to work on your own terms, on your own schedule, from the comfort of your own home. And I just want to acknowledge that is a privilege that most people don't have.
And I think this is such an important conversation to have here, too, at MSU. I teach a course that's called Capstone, Course for Human Capital and Society. And so this is a class for seniors in our major. And so I often ask them about, their careers and what they think their future of work would look like. And surprisingly, many of them actually say they prefer in-person work, and that stems from their sort of experiences of doing internships where a lot of them were remote, and they faced a lot of struggles that Tara was just talking about, right? And so, in one of their projects, which I make them do, in terms of sort of them identifying a challenge that some of these companies have in thinking about future of work, one of the groups have once identified sort of this discrepancy between or inequalities between some people who can work remote versus some people who have to be in person, right? And so that creates sort of this gap and inequalities, and creates a culture of feeling very different, even if they work in the same workplace. And so I think this is something that a lot of companies are still trying to figure out, and I think trying to move forward with it in a way that works for everyone.
I mean, what we can definitely say is that when you're working remotely, you're sort of treading water, you're holding still, you're not growing. And so in the context of education, there's a lot that is lost when you're trying to do that remotely. And we saw that there were lots of losses in students who were learning remotely longer, right? And you can easily model that. It's much more difficult to get noticed for a promotion if you're remote and other people are not remote, right? It's difficult to make your voice heard if you are already at risk of being marginalized. So we can think of this as an example of the sort of unfortunate consequence of technology, which is that it might not create new inequalities, but it definitely magnifies the inequalities that already exist in society, right? In almost every dimension, the introduction of technology sort of accelerates and magnifies inequalities. So remote work is one example of that, right? Like, there are some kinds of people who don't get to remote work. They get to ride a bus for 2 hours to go to work, right? That is another example of how technology makes life harder for some people. It doesn't have to be that way. This is not an inevitability, but it's something that is the natural course if we do nothing, right? So it's a call for us to do nothing. And think about, how do you build tools that don't have these consequences?
That's just like, I think we're having a better conversation because we're sitting in the same room and not on Zoom. It would have been fine, but there's just something hard to put your hands on that's better.
Exactly. Well, I mean, there's the eye contact problem in virtual communication, right? There's the all the nonverbals that don't come across in the same way. There's actually some of my students have done some really cool research about the effects of like technical problems on communication in the context of job interviews. And what happens is that if you have a bunch of lags and echoes and you are also an older adult, you get blamed for them. It's like, oh, you don't know how to use a computer. But if you're a young person and that happens to you, you get the benefit of the doubt. Like, it's not your fault that your computer lagged.
Interesting.
Right? So it's a new way of introducing bias into the interview system where there are these things that are out of people's control that they get blamed for. Like, if you've got a dog barking in the background of your Zoom, is that your fault? No, but you will get blamed depending on who you are and whether people want to make kind attributions about you.
Yeah. Well, researchers like you, after a Future of Work conference, usually have even more questions now. So what are you thinking about for the Future of Work #2 that's coming? And kind of a two-parter, if you were the czar of the future of work, what are some things you would like to implement?
Yeah, so we had a really terrific closing keynote speaker at the conference, Ruth Watkins from the Strada Education Foundation. And she used her time to pose these kinds of questions to the group. Like, if you could reinvent what MSU is tomorrow, what would you do? And it was a really fun conversation because I think people aren't used to thinking that way. Like, what would we do if we had to reinvent MSU? We don't know. But I think those kinds of conversations, like, what are the assumptions that we're making that we need to reconsider? That's where the conference sort of led for people. The other thing that was really clear is that we have so many engaged partners around the region that are eager to collaborate. And I think a lot of researchers left with new energy around that. So I've already heard from people who have formed new research teams, who have formed new collaborations, new grant proposals based on those conversations. So that's been very exciting to see. Like, I can already count 5 that I'm aware of. I myself got even more interested in the issue of skilled trades and apprenticeships and how we can improve those. Like, the stats are really interesting. You know, depending on the field that you go into, the outcomes can potentially be really terrific. Like, it's a great way to get a good paying, secure job. And how do we get more people to choose that? Like, especially in my case, I'm very interested in how do we get more women to become plumbers and welders and electricians, and why not choose those jobs, right? So that there's lots of exciting, like I said, energy around these topics, and it's been fun for me to sort of soak up that energy and try to direct it towards something productive.
Hey, Jen, what about you?
Yeah, and I think we're actually circling back to what Tara talked about in the beginning and how this is so relevant for Michigan. And I think it's just, it was such a great opportunity for MSU to get this exposure and, you know, really, put our focus back on thinking about workers and how we can really, design research programs and work together collaboratively with not just among academics and professors, right, but with the community partners and others who are just really interested and excited about this work and who really care about workers in Michigan. And Michigan and for the country, right? But I think this is such an exciting time for a lot of new developments, and I think it's also, it shows that we're also invited to talk in this podcast episode, and so I think it's been exciting.
It strikes me that, I mean, in the School of Human Resources and Labor Relations, you really are on the cutting edge of so many of these important issues right now. A real jewel at MSU for sure.
That's right. I mean, HRLR is special because of its multidisciplinarity and also because of its very strong outreach efforts. I mean, every time we see something on the news, I'm always guaranteed to know that someone in our school is working on it on the front lines, literally. And so that's terrific because everything global is local first, right? Like, you can't understand these big ideas unless you are understanding how they're playing out with the people around you. So in order to be the most impactful research institution having global impact, you also have to care about local impact. Yeah. And that's, I think, what the School of HRLR does amazingly well. But it's the whole university, and the College of Social Science has been a leader in saying social sciences have to be not just at everyone else's table, but bringing people to our table, showing people what the value of understanding human and these human technology systems really is. And not just sort of moralizing, but saying here are the consequences of ignoring this. Like, your tool isn't going to work. You can implement these location trackers for nurses, for example, so that you can deploy people to an emergency faster. That's a good idea. But if they're mad because you're using them to punish people, well, then they'll take those trackers off, throw them in the trash, throw them in an unused room, and now they're not serving the purpose they were meant to serve, right? So that's a human problem. That's not a design problem. And that's why the social sciences are so essential in these conversations.
Tara, this is really just the beginning of the Future of Work initiative, right? This first conference.
That's right. It was a convening to sort of get the momentum and the energy, and we already have a long list of future activities that are being planned. So one that I'll mention briefly is we are holding a summer school for PhD students from around the country to come learn from our experts. So we have a cohort of 15 students that's been selected, and they'll be here in July. We'll be taking them around to local organizations to do some brainstorming about research questions that could potentially respond to the needs of organizations in our area. We are having an ongoing speaker series where we'll be doing some of those additional follow-ups on themes and ideas that came out of the convening. As I mentioned, we're building new partnerships with teams of researchers and members of the community to obtain new research funding and funding for new programs. We're also potentially having conversations about new courses that we might offer or new visiting programs that we might offer. So there's lots and lots of excitement and making new things to support people who think about this issue of future of work in different ways. We have built these systems, people have built these systems, and understanding the people in the system is the way to make sure that our tools respond to our values and our goals as a society, and that we don't just let technologies run amok and respond to the needs of a few small corporations and harm a lot of people in the process. Like, we do actually have control over that. And so these conversations are important because we re-emphasize what are our values, what do we want to achieve, and what are the tools that we need to do so.
I mean, for me, the big takeaway from these conversations is to really think carefully about not just future of work, but future of workers and also the workplaces that they're in, right? And so there is really this ongoing transformation in the lives of workers and their well-being that are affected because of these changes and the future of work. And so it's really carefully thinking about, as a researcher, like, how and under what conditions these changes are contributing to worker well-being, and developing sort of ideas, and not just like sort of thinking about it in social science perspectives, but also thinking about, like, all right, what are some of the interesting new technological designs that can help workers, and also thinking about policies going forward as to whether, what are some of the policies that can look like, that can help workers in the future as they adjust to these changes, right? And so I think these are sort of important points for me, at least.
Well, can I just add on to that? So in the context of generative AI, as an example of what Hijin is saying, everyone gets excited about, oh, look, ChatGPT can write a poem or write an essay or write ad copy, right? Like, it's fun. But where does that come from? So number one, the model is trained on the inputs of human creativity, right? Like, we built that. Number two, a vast number of human workers are actively shaping that on a day-to-day basis, and those people are not treated well and they're not paid well. Third, there are enormous environmental impacts to these data centers, right? They require an enormous amount of energy, and we should decide if that's how we want our energy to be spent, right? I mean, the newest projections are that these data centers will need nuclear reactors just to have enough energy to keep functioning, and entire rivers will have to be diverted to cool them. So are we okay with that, right? Is that something that we want for ourselves? Is that the kind of workforce that we want to see? And so this is a decision that we have to be active in and not passive, and think about what are the policies that we want to put into place to build the society that we want, instead of letting it happen to us.
And last year, especially, we've seen lots of activities in the labor movement in Michigan. And to me, as a labor scholar, it was a very, very interesting time. And so I actually went out to some of the picket lines to speak to some of the workers. And because of also my research and my background, I went out to sort of observe workers for the casino strikes as well in Detroit. And so it lasted about a month at the end of last year. And part of the new contract that they actually ended up negotiating actually contains the language about technology for the first time ever. Right? And so it contains certain rules about requirements about letting workers know before I think it's around 6 months before these new technologies get implemented, right? And so that's one thing. I think another one was providing new training opportunities whenever there are these new technologies that get implemented. While we think this is such an obvious thing, it doesn't always happen. The training that they provide is often lacking and it's not comprehensive. And a lot of these workers are also immigrants, people of color, and much older. And so they do have trouble learning these new technologies. And I think third, they also put in a clause to provide healthcare benefits and severance pay for people who have to get laid off due to the introduction of new technology. And so to me, that really signifies a new sort of development towards thinking about technology and collective bargaining, right? And so I think we're seeing more and more of that getting implemented and thought through. And this is also why we think working with the union through these kinds of research programs is really, really important because we actually get to see what they do and how they can help workers. And so, but we're talking about like less than 7% of the private sector workforce who are unionized, right? And so I think it's also important to think about, all right, so then in non-unionized settings, what can we do, right? And how do we ensure that workers are able to exercise voice, right, without in the absence of unions, basically.
Because again, during the pandemic, there was some talk that some of the power was reverting back to the employees. Did you see that too? Is that sustainable, and is it happening? Are unions on the rise a bit?
Well, Hijin is the union expert here, not me. But I have seen no such trend of workers receiving more power over time. I think the only trend I can observe is a continuous decline. As some of the protections that used to exist for people are erased or reconfigured. And so that's something that I think we should urgently be concerned about.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have not seen the increase in the number of people who are joining unions, but I think, I feel optimistic after seeing what I saw in Michigan last year. And so I think going forward, it's important to sort of think about, okay, can workers gain power, and if so, how? And I think that's just sort of a continuation of our research program at MSU and at the School of Human Resources and Labor Relations with the scholars who really do a lot of really important and careful research on the rise in labor unions. But there has been a lot of conversations about revitalization of the labor movement and interesting and innovative tactics in terms of collective bargaining and negotiating. And so I think something to just really keep in mind as we discuss the future of work.
Well, we've been talking with Tara Berend. She's the initiative director of the Future of Work Initiative at Michigan State University and also the John Richard Butler II Endowed Professor in the School of Human Resources and Labor Relations. Thank you very much to Mr. Butler for his support. And Hijin Rowe is an assistant professor also in MSU's highly acclaimed School of Human Resources and Labor Relations. And I'm Russ White. This is MSU Today.